Well, thank you, Program Director, for the kind words of introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just put on the table a few issues on this subject, and hopefully in our interaction one can be able to elaborate. I would like to start by saying that in each society or community, a group of people will assign values to things. Beauty or that which is ugly, things of aesthetic value, that which is hurtful, and that which brings joy. But at the same time, the issues of freedom of expression are often contained in documents where we say they have some intrinsic universal value, where people would notice when they see it and would notice when it is denied. But in a divided society like ours, I think that line is not as straight, as neat, as clean as it should be. We have a history of division, and during all those centuries and years, I think different values to certain things developed. Different histories during the time of conflict. For example, the Liberation Song, which unfortunately the courts decided to call it "Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer," when the song itself is not that. And also the utterances by Malema. These are some of the instances which have actually raised the issue more recently. You'll remember the David Bullard's column, and you'll also remember what Eric Mieni has written more recently about the editor of City Press. You'll remember Zapiro, the debate around his cartoons, where the question of a satire and the boundaries where the satire can go as a freedom of expression. You'll also remember the Afrikaner cultural activist, what's his name? Steve Hofmeyr, who from time to time, as part of his ritual, will release his utterances which make very many of us very uncomfortable. And not only that, you will also remember that the cartoon which was in Denmark about Allah, which led to the widespread riots, killings at times. And you'll also remember the novel that was written by the British, who was Salman Rushdie, some years back. Maybe some of you may not remember. That in itself universally tells us that what we may see as freedom of expression in other instances may be understood as being a hate speech. So there's tension between the two, more so when you have a clash of civilizations, if I may just use Huntington's concept quite liberally. But besides that, for a moment, just reflect on groups which are powerful and constitute very strong lobbies. They have a way of presenting themselves and their truth, which is presented as universal, as natural, as common sense. In a divided society, common sense may be uncommon in other spheres. Let me give you one example which has nothing to do with hate speech. When Tony Yengeni came out of prison, he decided to slaughter an ox. South Africans, in their good sense, debated for the whole month the pain that these people were causing on cows and so forth. the animal rights groups were doing their part. I participated in that debate with, eminent persons who claim to be, the champions of animal rights. One question that I was raising, why would you have the whole nation so fixated with this person conducting a ritual slaughter of a cow when we've never had any debate about live lobsters being boiled in the northern suburbs of Sandton? Because if the pain is pain, it should be a pain that should be debated rather than this old ethnographic notion that the savages are on it again, they are slaughtering. In fact, just to draw the point, in that particular debate, I stressed the point by saying to the person I was debating with, how did you come to this meeting? And the person thought it was funny. He said, of what relevance is that? Then I said, please, if you can just help me with that answer. Finally, she said, yes, I drove here. I said, you know what? If you want evidence of a genocide on your windscreen, the insects which have been killed. Some were aunts and fathers and sisters of other insects. Of course, I was raising that point not because I was not concerned about cruelty to animals. I'm an owner of animals, dogs and other things. We even give names to cows. But it was a reflection that when a society with a history of division use its cultural prisms to understand what the other group is doing, you're more likely to revert back into a default of your stereotypes. Now, in these particular cases, I think we may say that it's clear what is hate speech, and it's clear what is freedom of expression. It's clear what is hateful or what is hurtful. But the lines are not as neat. Let me give you an example. We still have literature, we still have names which refer to the gaffers something, nooit gedacht, the ones without mind or without thinking, everywhere. We still have names like Verwoerd and Malan. The apartheid system was declared as a crime against humanity. But still, for those who were oppressed by that system, imagine Jews walking through Hitlerville every day. Now, without elevating those to say they should be graded at the same level as hate speech, it tells you that one person's pain may be another person's heritage. The same debate around the liberation songs. But does that mean that we should not be sensitive to the pain of our compatriots or different groups which might have a different perception? Absolutely not. But what it means is that we should never use legalistic means to deal with that which is political or cultural or social. You can regulate behavior, but you can't regulate attitudes. Those can only be dealt with at a level of conscientization, at a level of education, at a level of dialogue, where groups begin to acknowledge their fears, their anxieties and pains. That, to me, is about the only thing that we should recognize when we're talking about the freedom of speech, the freedom of this, and so forth. Again, some of us who believe fundamentally on social justice, we notice that in a society where status quo in subtle forms is being maintained, the emphasis on the first generation human rights, don't do this to me, don't do that to me, don't do that to so-and-so, are elevated above the second generation human rights. The responsibility of a society to give dignity to people by ending poverty, by giving them jobs. Nothing more is humiliating than sitting on a sidewalk, going to bed hungry. Those are some of the freedoms that we ought to elevate to the same level. But in a neoliberal arrangement, one, the individual is elevated instead of a group experience. Two, the don't touch me experience tend to be elevated more than the one of saying what are the responsibility of a society to those people who, because of historical, systemic, and structural reasons, might be left outside. The last point I want to make is this one. If for every one of these instances we run to courts, we run a risk of a judicial fatigue, because those with the resources consistently will be winning one case after the other until the system is delegitimized in the eyes of the public. If you are trying, as I was trying to help one person, these children, their mother died in a car accident in 2003 and has been trying to get a road accident fund to pay. Now, because they do not have resources, such matters cannot be elevated. But one insult tend to possess the entire nation. The media has a talk show here and another talk show, but such fundamental issues of social justice are secondary in the main. Let me give you another international context of human rights. I lived in the US for 6 years. I used to be fascinated by this notion of people walking through the security gates at the airport, hugging each other next to the plane. I said, but this thing doesn't happen in Europe, it doesn't happen in Africa, it doesn't happen in Asia. I asked them, they said, you know what, we're Americans, this is freedom. Until September 11th. When that happened, they swing the pendulum. All along, they used to brag about these freedoms. Another story, the WikiLeaks. The champions of freedom of access to information, some of them were a bit dazed by this champion of releasing information liberally. They were saying, but security reasons prevail. Not long ago, Britain, which had been tutoring and lecturing India and China about them limiting internet access and them threatening to shut down BlackBerry because they can't decode their codes. All of a sudden, Britain was saying this BlackBerry should be closed. It should be closed, this messaging system, because we can't crack through. Now, that's why these freedoms ought to be contextualized. A poor country will use physical means of taking the set away. A sophisticated one will use the cyberspace mechanisms of doing the same job. But now the one that doesn't have the means will always be told that you are still Stone Age in the way of doing things. So it's the same thing with the freedom of expression and and hate speech. Does it mean that John Kwelane was right in what he was saying about lesbians and gays? No. But what it means is that more profound and more important is an engagement and a dialogue. Imagine now if Eric Mieni had insulted me, I don't think the matter would have even made the same kind of adjectives being used. I don't think it would have made news. But now, again, with the media, I think the media tend to be, the fourth estate is more sensitive. You know that in the media, censorship takes place there at least 20 times in one day, and that is done by an editor. No, don't bring this one. I don't like that one. Bring this one. Okay, I like this one. Just cite that one. Okay, he said the full sentence. cut the part that agrees with your story. That's censorship continuously every day. But we call it editorial professional discretion. So those are some of the things. If I seem to be going off tangent, I'm trying to bring you the context of trying to understand just this concept of freedom of expression versus the hate speech. Thank you.
Thanks for those remarks. It makes my job a bit easier in that actually I just wanted to make one point tonight, which is that free speech versus hate speech, the dividing line, and as you correctly said, in my opinion as well, the dividing line is a wicked one in South Africa. And I actually just want to point out why the Freedom of Expression Institute is at a point where we feel we now need to go to the highest court to actually try and make that line straighter. And some of the issues that you've raised have been part of what I have been dealing with over the last while. You can imagine the kind of calls I get from journalists to comment on, from the Eric Miheni to the Julius Malema cases. But more recently and more interestingly, today and yesterday, it's all been about the views expressed by Justice Mogoeng in his minority judgment in the Robert McBride case. I'm sorry. We can talk about that later on. But the point is, in our view and all our experience and research over the last 2 years at FXI has shown that the problem we have is that the Equality Court, which in a way should govern the way in which we speak to each other as South Africans, and the equality legislation in relation to that, in our view, is way too broad. It will result in what you earlier called a clogging of our legal system. Everybody, in terms of the equality legislation, would be able to go to that court to seek redress. Since it's very difficult for me to determine what is hurtful to you or to somebody or to another group, and very often judges, in my opinion, get it wrong. We have been part of a number of discussions and debates and dialogues on this matter over the last 2 months, and clearly most of the legal opinion suggests that even in the case of Julius Malema versus the Sonke Gender Justice, it is unlikely that a normal court would have found him guilty, as did the Equality Court, simply because of the broadness and the vagueness of the way in which the legislation is written. So that's essentially the point I want to make, but let me just take you there with a few underlying issues. At FXI, we believe that interference in speech should be limited to basically 3 things. The one is it should be provided by law, as is the case in our country. It should pursue a legitimate aim, right? Limiting speech should pursue a legitimate aim. And thirdly, it should be necessary for a democratic society. I think some of the points made earlier by you reflects on that. We go further and we say that it should be clearly and narrowly defined. We can't have the broadness and vagueness that we have in particularly the equality legislation. I think some of the experts also argue that Section 16 of the Constitution, which governs hate speech and free speech, is also a bit too broad. But we feel that our first port of call should be the legislation that actually governs the way in which we speak to each other on a daily basis, which is the equality and anti-discriminatory legislation. We also feel that no one should be penalized for statements which are true. So if you are implying something in whatever you say and it is true, no matter where and how you say it, that you shouldn't be penalized for that. We also believe that no one should be criminally penalized for disseminating of hate speech unless it is been shown that they did so with the intention of inciting discrimination, hostility, or violence. In fact, in the American case, you will only be found guilty of hate speech in America if you can show that after you've spoken there will be violence. In our constitution it also speaks of imminent violence, and sometimes that is misconstrued by some of us, particularly with regards to the Julius Malema kill the boer, kill the farmer case. We also think that the right of journalists to decide how best to communicate information and ideas to the public should be respected, particularly when they are reporting on racism and intolerance, and that is something very important to South Africa. We think prior censorship, as we explained in newsrooms and wherever, should not be used as a tool against hate speech. We think care should be taken to apply the least intrusive and restrictive measures in recognition of the fact that there are various available measures, some of which exert less of a chilling effect on freedom of expression than others. Any imposition of sanctions should be in a strict conformity with the principle of proportionality and criminal sanction. And in particular, we don't think somebody should be imprisoned unless it is the last resort in terms of hate speech. And we're reasonably guided by that in terms of our constitution and the equality legislation. I'll take the liberty of just speaking briefly to those pieces of legislation, particularly Section 16 of the Constitution, as well as some of the prescripts in the equality legislation. The Constitution says everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes A, freedom of the press and the media, B, freedom to receive and impart information, C, freedom of artistic creativity, and D, academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. It goes further to say that the rights in subsection 1, which is 16.1, does not extend to, and these are the limitations that we have in terms of our constitution, A, propaganda of war, B, incitement to imminent violence, and C, which is the tricky one, and I think which is the one we always debate about, C, which is advocacy of hatred based on race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, that constitutes incitement to cause harm. Now again, the point is, what is harm, both in this context as well as in the context of the equality legislation. The equality legislation describes the clauses in hate speech sort of describes our actions in the following way. No person may publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate words based on one or more of the prohibited grounds against any person that could reasonably construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be hurtful, harmful, or incite harm, or promote or propagate hatred. That is the context within which we at FXI are saying it's too broad for us to have meaningful interaction with each other, because it will mean that anything you think is hurtful or harmful to you would give you the right to go to the Equality Court. Those who support this legislation says, but the reality is that those courts are not clogged at the moment. Not a lot of people are running to those courts, and therefore maybe the equality legislation governs us well and regulates our speech and our actions well, because clearly people are listening to what is written in that legislation. I disagree, because I think if we are all clear about what we are supposed to be saying to each other and how we're supposed to be saying to each other, it will naturally lead to us engaging meaningfully in terms of what we want to say and how we want to say it in South Africa. I think that we have, I've just gotten a mandate. I'm not sure if I should say this here, but I'll take the liberty of the protection of the Steve Biko Foundation. But we have evaluated a number of cases over the last while to see how we can engage the courts to try and narrow down the definitions, particularly in the equality legislation. And we have decided to take on the John Kwelani case as the case that would assist us in trying to narrow down the definitions in terms of hate speech in equality legislation. It might still be a far way off at the moment. Mr. Kwelani is is trying to rescind the decision of the Equality Court against him. That matter will be heard on the 23rd of August. And then afterwards, hopefully, when the main trial begins, we will enter as amicus of that court to try and show up the weaknesses that I've just spoken about. So that, to me, I mean, apart from all the other nice examples which I also wanted to speak to, but which was raised earlier on, I think that it's a really difficult and intense area. There's always the courts always have the responsibility to make sure that the interest of communities are taken seriously. Now I mentioned the nominee for Chief Justice, and part of the reason why people wanted me to comment today was because Justice Mogoeng, in his minority judgment on the Robert McBride case, referred to the fact that he thinks the right to dignity is just as important as the right to free speech. And journalists are implying that he might not be the right man for the job because he would judge favorably in terms of particularly individuals instead of society at large. In fact, 702 journalist was asking me directly whether this means you can't shout at Jacob Zuma as the president. So the point is, I mean, it's really important for us that we try and clarify the lines and try and make the line as straight as possible with regards to what we mean when we say free speech and what we mean when we say hate speech. And I hope that we can engage positively after this.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much.